at the edge of a community, they don't stop within one company, and they don't stop across borders. These truly are global risks with potential global impact.
Geoeconomic confrontation tops the risk ranking for the first time. Why not?
I think we can see the evidence of this all around us, or the beginnings of a lot of concerns about what that means overall for the global economy. Tariffs, sanctions, investment screening, competition around critical minerals and resources. We're seeing all of that play out right now. And so quite understandably, both for 2026 and 2 years out up until 2028, leaders and experts have put this as the #1 risk.
Economic risks have surged more than any other category. Downturn, inflation, asset bubbles, all spiking. Are we heading for a global recession?
I think we certainly don't see any evidence pointing to a global recession, but there is rising concern about global economic risks. So I think you already mentioned some of the key ones: debt, inflation, and the potential risk of asset bubbles. I do want to make sure that we emphasize none of these are predictions. What they are is what is top of mind for leaders and what are they seeing rising to the surface when it comes to thinking about risks a couple of years out. So these are the ones that have shot up the most, but they're still somewhere between rank 10 and rank 21 out of the 33 global risks. So they're still somewhat middle of the rankings, but they've just shot up because they had really gone down in terms of concern over the last few years. And again, it's not sort of surprising. So for example, when it comes to inflation, over the last year, the global economy did quite well and stayed relatively resilient in the face of higher tariffs. But there is this concern that there's a lag effect, but this year we may see rising inflation and the impact of those tariffs. So that is why some of this is going up. Again, when it comes to the valuations of artificial intelligence related companies, we're seeing some of those valuations be very high and stay high, and that is all dependent on the one hand, the potential huge opportunities of artificial intelligence, but there is also a fairly well predicted concern around could this also lead to a bubble. So those are the kinds of things that we're seeing. And of course, when it comes to debt, we're in some of the most indebted situations for advanced economies, in addition to some developing economies that have been facing debt and currency related risks for some time.
So you mentioned already AI in terms of potential bubble. AI anxiety has soared. Adverse outcomes of AI jumped from 30th place in the short-term outlook to 5th place in the long-term outlook. What are experts most worried about?
That's the biggest jump we've seen in this last year, 25 ranks across the 33 risks that are being ranked. So in the shorter term, I think, again, and we see this in the markets, there's a sense that artificial intelligence comes with huge opportunities, and in the relatively short term, most companies, most countries are likely to benefit from it. But when it comes to that 10-year outlook, that's where concern really goes up, and I think that's because a lot of leaders and experts are seeing that on the one hand opportunity, but on the other hand, it's growing largely unchecked, and there isn't really as much governance around it as I think they feel is necessary given the set of risks involved. And there are 3 sets of risks they're concerned about. One, when it comes to jobs in the labor market, what is artificial intelligence likely to do there, and will people be able to keep up? The second is around society. So what does artificial intelligence mean, not just for mis and disinformation, but for mental health challenges? And then the third element is the use of artificial intelligence in warfare, especially in a world where, as we said, competition has really grown.
Environmental risks have dropped in the short-term rankings, yet dominate the long-term. Why is that?
I think it's really to do with all of these other risks that we've just mentioned. When there's so much short-term focus around interstate conflict, which is the second highest risk in 2026, geoeconomic confrontation, concerns around mis and disinformation in the short term, rising concerns about economic risks, rising concerns about the long-term effects of technology, societal polarization, inequality, you put all of that together, and there's so much focus on that in that shorter term, environmental risks have fallen in severity and therefore have gone down in the rankings. But 10 years out, as you said, it is still extreme weather that's a concern, loss of biodiversity, the change to critical earth systems. These are really the things that people are concerned about 10 years out, and rightly so, because these are existential risks. And it's very concerning that if we do lose the focus on these in the short term, we're not going to be ready to adapt and mitigate 10 years out. So while it does show up in the longer term rankings higher, it actually is a here and now risk.
So what solution should we look towards? Is cooperation possible in such a landscape?
Yeah, so this is where I think the biggest underlying concern comes through. The collective capacity of leaders to be able to address these risks in this age of competition, where there is a decline or a stepping away from some of the more traditional multilateral system, I think that's really the key issue, because these risks don't really know any borders. These are global risks. And the big concern is, will we have the coordination and cooperation capacity that is going to be required by governments if any of these risks start to materialize in the short term? So for example, if there were to be an economic crisis unfolding of whatever kind among the ones that have been identified here, would we have the kind of coordination capacity that existed around the global financial crisis? That's really the concern that leaders and experts are pointing to here, that will we actually be able to cooperate in the way that's required? And that cooperation is necessary for any one of these risks, whether it's health or pandemic-related risks, as we saw some years ago, whether it's economic risks, technology would require global governance. So all of that would require the kind of cooperation that we just don't see right now the impetus for. And perhaps let me add one other piece here. So we do ask leaders how they think the global order would look in the next few years. And most of them expect that we will now have a multipolar order emerging. And under 6% expect that we would return to a sort of the unipolar multilateral order that we've seen in the past. And again, that means a whole new set of alliances and approaches to cooperation, and something new would need to come together to build our collective muscle to still be able to cooperate.
Thank you very much, Sadia. We will now have some time for questions from the media. So I would ask the media to relate the questions to the Global Risk Report and keep them concise so we can take as many as possible. So if I'm not mistaken, we have a live question from the German TV ZDF, from Florian Neuhan. Is Florian with us?
Yes, hello, nice to see you.
Hello, nice to see you. What is your question?
Thank you very much for taking my question, Florian Neuhan, German TV. My question would be, when you look at businesses, companies throughout the Western world, do you feel they are prepared for the rising risks, especially of geoeconomic confrontation? And what could they do in order to prepare for these risks?
Thank you very much. Sadia.
I think the biggest concern that we see from businesses is previously supply chains had been geared towards efficiency, and they've been operating in a world of cooperation. We first saw major disruptions to those supply chains in the last few years during the pandemic, and then since then, because of both interstate conflict and now the new sort of geoeconomic confrontation that exists. And so supply chains are now having to be oriented towards security. They're having to be oriented towards focusing on who can you trust and who can you not trust. Where do you actually put in place investments in a world in which it's very unclear where alliances will go? So I think in a nutshell, companies are having to adapt. Are they prepared today? I think they're on the way towards preparation and are trying to learn also from each other. And this is one of the types of conversations that will take place next week week at our annual meeting. And then the second element there is we've heard from quite a few emerging market players that say that we have been operating in a world in which supply chains have not been that easy to manage, in which alliances have shifted over time, and actually we might be better prepared than many of the businesses that emerge from advanced economies. I think that's a viewpoint, but that's some of what we're picking up.
Thank you. I have a question here from Associated Press. Jamie Keaton, I don't think we have him live with us, so I'm going to read out the question, which is geoeconomic confrontation is the top risk. We talked about that. That sounds based and vague. Can you please elaborate?
Sure. I think this really relates to certainly tariffs, and we've seen an increase on tariffs over the last year, although still lower than what was originally being envisaged. And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen the global economy remain relatively resilient, but the risk that's being pointed out here is will that resilience continue? In addition to that, you're seeing different kinds of measures when it comes to investment screening, and that is changing the outlook for foreign direct investment as well. We're also seeing a lot more control of critical minerals and critical resources. And of course, this is not just about one actor or two actors. This is about the overall shift that leads to in the global economy. And if everybody starts doing the same thing, then we really start moving into a very economically difficult situation, because I think, as we all know, it is really not possible for each country to be able to be fully economically nationalistic, to rely only on itself. So that overall is what we mean by geoeconomic confrontation. And when economic policy tools start becoming essentially weaponry instead of a basis for cooperation, that's where the overall risk becomes much higher for crises to unfold and for the lack of capacity to be able to deal with them. And of course, all of this impacts people day to day, right? So if the price of very basic goods start changing for people, prices are going up, they're having to deal with a much higher cost of living, and at the same time, wages are not necessarily increasing to the same amount. So that's where we really see that this is triggering then greater concerns about societal polarization, about inequality. So yes, it's geoeconomic confrontation, but it has huge repercussions for day to day.
Thank you, Sadia. We have also a question from Le Temps that I'm going to read out also. What are the main differences and surprises in this year's report?
So I think one is the question that we just responded to, geoeconomic confrontation jumping up to the very top, more so than a lot of other concerns. So that's certainly one, and it jumped up 8 positions. I think a second element is the unfortunate deprioritization of environmental risks. And this has been top of mind for the leaders and experts that have answered the survey over many years now. This is an issue that has been going up and up and up in the rankings over the last 10 years. But we see this shorter-term deprioritization, which of course is deeply concerning. I think the third element is around artificial intelligence and the fact that there is this longer-term concern where it jumps from all the way towards the bottom, number 30, all the way through to number 5 to 10 years out, and then finally economic risks. I think those are the ones where, yes, they're still middle of the rankings, but those are pretty big jumps that have happened in most of those. So people are watching out for the risk of inflation, for the risk of debt, and for the broader concerns around a potential bubble.
Thank you. We're going to go to the banker. If I'm not mistaken, we have Gabriel Witham with us for a live question.
Hi, good morning. Gabriel Witham, the banker. How much does the decline in multilateralism and collaboration make it hard to deal with the risks this report warns of?
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thanks for that question. I think this is definitely a key concern across the report. So on the one hand, this age of competition has emerged as that multilateral system has started declining or becoming more ineffective. But at the same time, that is then fueling a further fracturing of that multilateral system. And would we then have the capacity that leaders would need to be able to deal with crisis? And I gave the example earlier around economic risks. Would we have the coordination capacity needed to deal with if there were to be a major debt crisis, if there were to be an asset bubble that was bursting? How would leaders be prepared to deal with it? But I think that applies equally so to climate. Are we likely to see the same kind of cooperation? And there are definitely some very clear signals that we're not. And that kind of cooperation would be needed on the mitigation front, but it would also be needed when it comes to adaptation. There's perhaps one more piece around this, which is developing economies in this new age of competition are facing a much more uncertain outlook than they have before. Traditionally, they have relied on global economic cooperation, or essentially what is known as globalization, to be able to grow, and that has lifted so many people out of poverty in the last 20 to 30 years. That system just to growth for growth just doesn't quite exist at the moment. And so there's also this longer-term concern that as the multilateral system and global economic cooperation mechanisms start declining, what is the new pathway for 4 billion people around the world?
Thank you, Sadia. We have also a question from Bernama TV, that's from Malaysia, from Aziri Idris. We don't have her live with us, but I'm going to read out the question. So what are the most critical global economic risks highlighted in the Global Risk Report, and how could they impact Malaysia?
Right, so let me go down a few of those rankings. So there's a concern about economic downturn. That goes up 8 positions to number 11 now. So we don't see, as I said earlier, the risk of a downturn or a recession among the top 10, but it has risen to 11 over the next couple of years, which is certainly much higher than it has been in the past. The second element is inflation. So this had really fallen down the list after having risen in the past during the inflation that followed directly after the pandemic, but it's now jumped 8 positions to 21st again. Again, in the lower half of the rankings, but certainly higher than it was before. And then finally, the concerns about a potential asset bubble have gone up 7 positions to the 18th position, again in the middle of the rankings, but it has gone up in the past in this past year. Now, how does that impact a country like Malaysia or other large emerging markets that are critical to global supply chains? Any economy that is dependent on trade for even a part of its growth is going to be affected by tariffs and by the concerns around geoeconomic confrontation. And then in addition to that, I think if any of these concerns about inflation or asset bubbles or an economic downturn were to start materializing, that will have a huge impact on demand, both locally and on demand for goods and services that come from large emerging markets like Malaysia. So I think as a key and significant player in East Asia and in much of the world, I think that's where the issue really lies. But that's not to say that it isn't possible for large countries to have agency. And I think we're also starting to see on the flip side of this, that this more unsettled picture is leading to new alliances, new regional trade agreements, new unilateral or bilateral trade agreements. So there is also a shift towards the more positive in this current outlook.
And we can remind media that we have a special section where you can look up country.
Absolutely. There's country-level risks that you can see at the very end of the rankings. Again, not predictions, but those are the views of business leaders as to what the translation of those global risks is at a national level.
Thank you. We have also a question from CNBC, from Contessa Brewer. I'm going to read it out. We talked about it, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper. In what way have the risk around geoeconomic confrontation evolved to drive this to the top position of concerns?
Yeah, I think this is where it's a combination of things that is coming together. So on its own, if the focus had been, for example, just tariffs, to put it that way, or if it had been just a concern around, for example, more investment screening, or just the control of critical, but we're seeing all of this happening together. And then compounded on top of that, this is landing in the midst of a situation where societal polarization is already very high. That is in fact what has led to a lot of economic nationalism. But unfortunately, the blowback from some of these types of policies is likely to be higher prices, higher affordability issues, higher cost of living, and that is likely to again fuel further that societal polarization and the concerns around inequality. So I think that is why we're seeing it rising to the top. It's not just because the immediate short-term material impact to businesses, but also what that means for societies more broadly.
Thank you, Sadia, and thank you for all the questions from the media. We're going to be next week in Davos, a meeting that will have a very strong participation, so it will be really interesting to follow that. Sadia, if you could get one message across to the leaders gathering in Davos next week, what would it be?
I think the key one is really that these are really not predictions. The future is not fixed. This is all fully within the control and choices that leaders make. Yes, climate change is a key underlying structural factor, but there is certainly still time to act. When it comes to some of these economic risks, yes, they're rising up in the rankings, but none of them have actually materialized yet. And so again, it is very much within the control of leaders. So as we enter this 21st year of the Global Risks Report, our sense is, yes, we're in a world of greater competition. Yes, cooperation may be different than it has looked in the past, but it's really up to leaders to be able to bring people together. And that's what we are doing next week. Under this broader theme of the spirit of dialogue, we are bringing together leaders, 3,000 leaders from over 130 countries. And the idea is to take a very objective, clear-eyed look at where these issues stand, where the positives are, because there are, of course, many opportunities as well, and combine that with a very clear-eyed outlook on what these risks look like, and to try to understand what might be still areas of cooperation. And some of that cooperation will not only be between states, it will also be between the private sector working together, or the public sector and the private sector coming together. And the forum has always tried to be a platform for coalitions of the willing to come together. And I think that's what we'll see next week.
Thank you, Sadia. And you will be able to follow us in Davos next week live on our website and the different channels there. So we have reached now the end of the questions and from the media and the briefing. Thank you for everybody. Thank you, Sadia, for your insights. And see you all next week in Davos.
Thank you, Jan.
Bye.